World One SA leader Mmusi Maimane says he worked with Dr. Buthelezi in Parliament as he collaborated across various forums on him to form coalition agreements. And he joins us live from Cape Town this morning. Mmusi, thank you so much for your time. I have visited Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi in his office, and he was very much at home in that space because he's seen it all, but at that stage already. And you would have seen some of that with him. Talk to us about what you will remember the most of your interactions with him in those halls of Parliament over the years.
Well, I think along with many South Africans, I want to send my deepest condolences, not only to his party, to his family, to the people of South Africa, and certainly the Zulu nation. I think I joined along with many others and say, here's a South African who played an incredible role in our body politic, has died. And therefore, as the people of this country, we mourn his contribution, both good and bad. But equally so, we recognize the role that he has played. I think, in my interactions with Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, I always found, in some ways, that deep English, the use of the English language as something that was always fascinating to me, that I felt like speaking to him was you needed to bring a dictionary to sit and listen to. And I think equally so, I know many people have reflected on the fact that he was always smiling. I found him often steely in the sense that you could not, you had to almost always in permanent observance of protocol. You dare never call him by any other name other than Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi. Or you could dare never, conduct yourself outside of protocol. It would be, cardinal a sin. So I found him that way. I hung out with him a lot in a number of social engagements. We attended weddings together. I've been to his birthday. And I always, in that context, found him highly relatable, warm, almost grandfatherly, because by the time he got to Parliament, it was in his late 70s, early 80s, in that sense. And so we really had a grandfather voice, so that every time Parliament got a little bit chaotic, he'd be the grandfather who would stand up and call everybody to order, as it were.
He did take his role as mentor very seriously, and I wonder what you think about what he thought of the younger generation, specifically in his party, but also in Parliament, coming through the ranks. How do you think he thought of the new generations coming through?
Oh, I mean, I think, in that sense, he was always committed to, if you like, values of respect. And I think he would judge the character of the next generation of leaders as to whether they'd be respectful to the elderly, true to custom and tradition, or not. And so I always found him very much always trying to restore values in that sense and calling us to a sense of going, will you respect our traditions? And I think he thought of himself as one who had to preserve that and make sure that all of us conduct ourselves in that way. So in many ways, I think reflectively, I can think through the fact that one of the things that he will leave behind, certainly memorable for me, is always to keep that sense of respect. You can disagree but not be disagreeable, but also to know that you have a duty when you step into the halls of Parliament, because I think he took that institution seriously. He didn't think of it as a game, and he certainly, at the time, recognized the importance of what members of Parliament did. And so, yeah, I honor him for that. I also think one of the lessons I'll take is the bravery. He was always, when it was unpopular to do something, he had the courage and the fortitude to do it regardless of his own popularity. And as I say, even in his address to various communities that South Africans would not see him being associated with. At the time, it was not popular maybe to be associated with the Jewish community, and yet Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi was very strong at that. I also don't discount the fact that in growing up in Soweto, the violence between the IFP and many other communities is something that we cannot forget. So I always had that contradiction when I found my interactions with him. And in fact, in a book, I remember a book was written by one of the leaders of our former party, and Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi took it upon himself to write me this long formal submission to say, let us interrogate the history of what went on here.
In as much as we speak of him being the grandfather and the mentor in Parliament, and that's what we remember about him quite recently, my colleague Mabutu made the point that at the time around when he was a student activist, he was a member of the ANC Youth League, and then got to the point of starting the movement as it was at the time of the eNCA Freedom Party, that he and his peers would have been seen as the EFF of their times. Do you feel like he never forgot that firebrand that he was, even as he moved into his more elder statesman part of his career?
To sum up that point, I would say when Prince Mangosuthu was friendly towards you, you had a good day. But if he turned against you, it was ruthless. It didn't matter at what age this was. I mean, I could remember him taking Ambridge with one of the MPs who had, I mean, it was a genuine attempt to greet him. And so he ran behind him and touched him over his shoulder. Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi was so offended at that in his language, in his tone, he was so angry that I even felt sorry for the MP, but I just thought this wasn't even a big deal. But he was, so the ruthlessness that came with him certainly is something that even in his later years, it's something you could not ignore in any other way. But, you know, I think that on principle, on issues like that, it was always necessary to have his voice, certainly when we were even discussing coalition negotiations, to say, how do we work together on this regard? How do we collaborate and work towards building a government that works? And, you know, there were difficult days, but he was fairly ruthless if you crossed him in this regard.
Speaking of coalitions, my colleague Siphamandla Goge was saying in his last few interactions with the Prince that he had again expressed his hope that in his last season on Earth, he would somehow see the ANC and the IFP find each other again and be closer to each other around the same table, or at least on the same page. But we are living in a very divisive political time, and coalition is a term now that we use on the hour, every hour. He was a political realist, though. Do you think that he made peace with the fact that right now wouldn't be the time for the IFP as it stands and for the ANC, where it finds itself in history, to find each other, and that there would have to be other political partnerships more fitting for the eNCA Freedom Party?
I think going now that we're discussing what happens post facto, I do think, even in my interactions with him, I know when dealing even with President Zuma, there were moments where we moved motions of no confidence, and Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi and the IFP would abstain in a vote like that, where we thought to ourselves, this is a very obvious violation of the Constitution. He would abstain. So I can't discount and dismiss his relationship with certainly President Zuma and certainly with the ANC. And I think going forward now, it's going to be an interesting discussion for the IFP to hold as to what they hope to achieve and whether or not they could forge ahead that relationship going forward. It certainly was one of the more contentious areas that at times you almost had multiple negotiating blocks. We had to negotiate with the opposition writ large, so every other party except the IFP. And then the IFP leaders would go back and consult with the Prince, and then we'd almost have to have a different conversation with the IFP in dealing with coalitions. And I think that might still continue for a long while, that you might find a block that sets itself up with the IFP needing special treatment, or maybe in some ways a different conversation to take place.
Mr. Maimane, you're now speaking to Mabutu Ngcobo. There is what media scholars called mediated narrative. That is Maimane, as we know him based on what we read on newspapers. And then there is that impression about a person, a politician, when you meet him face to face. Now, tell us about your impression of Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi before you met him in Parliament based on the mediated narrative, and your impression when you met him in Parliament.
You know, naturally, as I said earlier, I'd grown up in the 80s. I'd grown up in violence, and so there was a certain degree of trepidation that and intimidation that came with Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi. And certainly in the literature that I'd read about him, and obviously the mediated narrative had its own stance on that issue. And I think now is not the time to go into that history. But in my meeting with him, as I found him warm, I always found him, as I say, I could comfortably sit in a context and refer to him as even like my own grandfather. You know, when we worked together, I honestly, I can remember his birthday, his 80th birthday, and how joyous he was at that birthday and how warm and welcoming he was. As I'd been to, I remember we went to a wedding together, his family, my wife, and honestly, it was a joy always to be around him. And I think in some ways, the older he became, even though still steely, as I said earlier, he became mellowed out in terms of his relations to others. He in the way that, you know, I've never walked away from Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi without him giving me a hug. He was always embracing in that sense. And so the personable, to me, in many ways, were the kind of person that you knew that when you spoke to him, you had to follow protocol, but even so, he would stop and embrace. And I think, you know, if I think about all political leaders in Parliament, there's probably one I've held hands with more than any other one because of just sometimes his affection physically being wanting to hold on to you when he was speaking to you.
And the last one from me, Mr. Maimane. The IFP has been so much associated with Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi. I know you are a politician, you're not a political analyst. But how do you see his political party without him going forward, especially now we are about to approach the 2024 elections?
I think it's going to be difficult because the brand Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, I mean, he was the face of the election campaign even when he wasn't the leader of the IFP. And so Prince Vilenkosi Hlabisa, who I've come to know in recent while, is going to have to work hard to not only assert his leadership on the party, but assert his leadership on the followers of the IFP. I know very well that Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi was the glue that held the party together. And so his parting does bring into sharp focus what the IFP's reaction to the issue is going to be and what the ordinary supporters are going to work with. But I certainly do think that it's important that going into elections, given the significance of that election and the need for change and the prominence of IFP in KZN, that it becomes an important electoral footground. And so whatever needs to be done to ensure that works, that succeeds, I think is absolutely vital. And I would certainly do every effort I can in working with Prince Ubabu Hlabisa to ensure that we find a way to ensure that there's electoral success in KZN and we can bring about the appropriate change. And so for me, it would have been, I do think, you can say all you like about Prince Mangosuthu and his relationship to the ANC. He certainly detested corruption, and I think it is something that we cannot put up with. And I think that's a journey that we have to go on in bringing about that change.
Okay, thank you so much for that insight there. Mmusi Maimane is the leader of Build One SA. We thank him for his time this morning and as he joins us virtually from Cape Town.